who worked with several of the greatest pitchers in American baseball history and adapted his methodology for football, described Rogers' form as technically close to the biomechanical ideal. His release was extraordinarily fast, meaning that the window of time between when he identified the open receiver and when the ball left his hand was smaller than any pass rush system could consistently predict. A linebacker who arrived a second late was always late. His mobility added a dimension that didn't show up in running statistics but was fundamental to understanding his dominance. Rogers wasn't a running quarterback in the traditional sense. He didn't build his offense around scrambles and runs, but within the pocket he moved with a fluidity that widened the window of time before each decision. He extended plays that should have resulted in sacks and converted them into touchdowns. He improvised with the same naturalness with which he executed rehearsed plays, which made any defense that had specifically prepared for the Packers' game plan perpetually vulnerable to the unexpected. Over the years, their wide receivers have been the protagonists of one of the most productive partnerships in the NFL. Jordy Nelson, who would become one of the most underrated receivers of his generation, had in Rogers the quarterback who transformed his natural talent into historic numbers. Donald Driver was the reliable receiver during the transition years. Randall Cobb brought speed and versatility. Davante Adams would later establish a connection that many analysts have classified as the best quarterback-wide receiver duo of its era. The 2014 season brought another individual MVP. Rogers threw for 4,281 yards, 38 touchdowns, and only 5 interceptions, with a passer rating of 112.2. The Packers reached the NFC Championship game against the Seattle Seahawks, and what happened that afternoon is studied in game analysis programs to this day. Green Bay was winning 19-7 in the fourth quarter. Victory seemed assured. And then the Seahawks executed one of the greatest comebacks in NFL playoff history, scoring 15 points in the final few minutes of the game and winning in overtime. The loss to Seattle in 2014 was painful in a particular way. It wasn't just a playoff elimination. It was an elimination that had come back from a win. The kind of experience that tests not only a quarterback's performance, but his ability to process sporting injustice and show up to practice on Monday. Rogers showed up. He always showed up. The 2016 season produced one of the most memorable moments of his career, and possibly the most famous line from any quarterback in recent decades. On November 6, 2016, after a loss to the Indianapolis Colts that left Green Bay with a record of 4 wins and 6 losses, in a season that seemed to be going off the rails, Rogers gave an interview to Milwaukee radio. With the calm of someone not improvising but articulating something he genuinely believes, he said his team would run the table, win all the remaining games. It wasn't arrogance, it was a diagnosis. The Packers won the next 6 games of the regular season. They made it to the playoffs and kept winning. They went to the NFC Championship game against the Atlanta Falcons, one of the most explosive teams in the NFL that season. Rogers threw for 287 yards and 2 touchdowns in the game, but the Falcons won 44-21 in an offensive performance so dominant it seemed to belong to another sport. The elimination came after a streak that had confirmed exactly what he had promised on the radio. The Falcons went to the Super Bowl, and Aaron Rodgers went back to Chico in his head, to that kid in the garage, and waited for the next season. The years between 2017 and 2019 were marked by season-ending injuries that put into perspective the physical vulnerability of an athlete who seemed built above such mundane concerns. In 2017, in the 8th week of the season, Rogers fractured his right collarbone in a game against the Minnesota Vikings. The season ended for him before he could continue. It's not the kind of injury a quarterback overcomes in weeks. It's the kind of injury that requires surgery, rehabilitation, and a rebuilding of confidence in one's own movements that can be more difficult than physical healing. He returned in 2018 and played a season that included one of the most extraordinary moments of his career, a comeback from a 20-point deficit against the Chicago Bears in a game the Packers needed to win to keep their playoff hopes alive. Rogers led several drives in the fourth quarter with precision that seemed calculated but was improvised, and Green Bay won 24-23. It was the kind of game analysts save for when they want to explain what separates the great from the very good. In 2019, the Packers hired Matt LaFleur as their new head coach, and LaFleur's arrival represented a system change that initially raised doubts about how Rodgers would adapt to an offense that emphasized the run more and simplified certain aspects of the passing game. The adaptation wasn't immediate, but the Packers finished with 13 wins and 3 losses, and Rodgers demonstrated that his game intelligence was flexible enough to operate within structures different from those he had mastered for years. And then came 2020, the season that reminded the world what Aaron Rodgers was capable of when everything was aligned around him. The 2020 season was, statistically, the best of his career. Rodgers completed 70.7% of his passes for 4,299 yards. His touchdown and interception numbers that season were 48 and 5, respectively, producing a passer rating of 121.5. His touchdown per attempt rate was 8.9%, a number that defies any non-hyperbolic historical comparison. He was named NFL MVP for the second time, 15 years after his first season as a professional starter. What made the 2020 season particularly significant was the context. The NFL had been played during the COVID-19 pandemic, with no fans in the stands, or with extremely reduced attendance depending on the stadium and local regulations. The silence of the stadiums changed the emotional texture of the game in a way that no player could fully describe. For Rodgers, who had always operated with the noise of Lambeau Field as part of his natural work environment, playing in silent stadiums was an alien experience. He played as if the noise had never mattered. The Packers reached the NFC Championship game in January 2021 to face Tom Brady's Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The game was played at Lambeau Field, but the stands had reduced capacity due to health protocols. And what happened that afternoon was another painful elimination. The Buccaneers won 31-26, and Brady went to the Super Bowl, while Rodgers returned to his stadium's locker room for the 5th time without managing to advance beyond the NFC Championship game. Number 5. 5 playoff appearances, 5 eliminations before the Super Bowl. The exception had been 2010, when the journey had gone all the way and ended with the trophy. But 5 conference championship eliminations throughout a career that was undeniably elite created a narrative that never completely left Rodgers. The discussion about his legacy always returned to this point. A man with his numbers, his accuracy, his game intelligence should have more than one Super Bowl. The issue is complex because American football is not an individual sport. A quarterback can be perfect, and his team can lose if the linebacker makes a mistake or if the returner drops a ball at the wrong time. The 2014 season itself is the clearest example. Rodgers had a passer rating of 112.2 for the season, and the elimination came in a way that most analysts attributed much more to the defensive collapse and tactical decisions in the fourth quarter than to any quarterback error. In 2021, Rodgers won his 3rd NFL MVP, becoming one of the few players in league history to win the award 3 times. He threw for 4,115 yards, 37 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions, with a passer rating of 111.9. The season was also marked by controversy regarding his COVID-19 vaccination, when public statements he had made about his immunization status contradicted official statements, generating a debate that occupied sports pages for weeks. It was the first major episode in which Rodgers' public persona became more complex, more human, and inevitably more controversial than the flawless sports icon that stories of overcoming adversity sometimes create. He is a man who always wanted to be more than a symbol. In the moments when he spoke about his personal life, his interests in philosophy, his intellectual curiosity, his relationship with spiritual practices that included ayahuasca retreats described in his own words as transformative, Rodgers demonstrated that the distance between his public persona and his private persona was smaller than celebrities usually allow. This generated admiration and criticism in almost equal measure, which is probably the surest sign that someone is being genuine. In 2022, Rodgers won his 4th NFL MVP, tying Peyton Manning for the number of MVP awards, 4 times chosen as the league's best player. 4. In different decades, in different offensive systems, against defenses that had been specifically designed to stop what he did, and which had failed with a regularity that the awards accurately document. The decision to leave Green Bay was announced in March 2023, when the Packers and Aaron Rodgers agreed it was time to go their separate ways. After 18 seasons with a single organization, Rodgers was traded to the New York Jets. The trade represented something rare in American football, an elite quarterback in the final stages of his career having the opportunity to start over in a new city, with new teammates, in a franchise that hadn't won the Super Bowl since Joe Namath's title after the 1968 season. New York is not Green Bay. The Jets operate in a different market, under different media pressure, with a fan base that has carried decades of alternating frustration and hope. Rodgers arrived at MetLife Stadium in August 2023 with the weight of expectations that few quarterbacks would have willingly accepted to carry at that stage of their careers. What happened next was devastating in the most unpredictable way. In the first game of the 2023 season, on September 11th, in the Jets' second offensive series against the Buffalo Bills on Monday Night Football, Aaron Rodgers received a snap, backed up, and was tackled by Haason Reddick. In the fall, his left Achilles tendon ruptured. He was on the field for 4 plays as the Jets' starting quarterback. 4 plays. The severity of a ruptured Achilles tendon for a 40-year-old athlete is difficult to overstate. For most players in that age range, it would be the end. The realistic scenario for any 40-year-old with this injury is forced retirement, not reconstruction. Rodgers chose reconstruction. He spent months in intensive rehabilitation. He appeared at Jets events while recovering. He spoke publicly about his process, and in March 2024, he confirmed his intention to return for the following season. The 2024 season was his effective return to the field after the injury, and he played enough games to show that, even at 40 years old, his game reading remained intact. The body had suffered. The mind remained. When you consider 18 seasons and more than 2 decades of high-level American football, Aaron Rodgers' numbers speak with a clarity that makes any argument against his place among the greatest difficult to sustain. More than 59,000 passing yards in his regular career, more than 475 touchdowns, an interception rate that, throughout his career, remains among the lowest in the history of the position. 4 regular season MVP awards, 1 Super Bowl win, 1 Super Bowl MVP. But the numbers don't capture what makes Rodgers unique in the most important way. What defines his greatness is not just what he did, but how he did it, under what conditions, against what adversities, and with what consistency over time. Consistency is the most difficult attribute to maintain in professional sports, because it requires not only talent, but management, not only skill, but durability, not only intelligence, but the ability to renew that intelligence season after season against opponents who have studied his every tendency and built entire plans to neutralize it. Rodgers was never neutralized for an extended period. There were tougher seasons, there were injuries, there were systems that adapted around him in ways that weren't always ideal. But year after year, the production returned, the passer rating returned, the numbers that justify the legacy conversation returned. The comparison with Tom Brady is inevitable, and, to some extent, unfair to both, because they try to measure different things with the same yardsticks. Brady won 7 Super Bowls and built his legacy around collective victory and longevity. Rodgers built his around such complete technical mastery that generations of young quarterbacks will grow up studying his mechanics, his game reading, his ability to process information in fractions of a second within a pocket that is being destroyed around him. Rodgers' influence on subsequent generations is already visible. College quarterbacks who reach the NFL today were shaped by coaches who studied his tapes. The style of mobility within the pocket that defines a generation of modern quarterbacks has in Rodgers one of its fundamental examples. The combination of surgical precision with the ability to improvise that characterizes the best quarterbacks of the next generation has in Rodgers' career a reference text that will not be discarded anytime soon. There's something few documentaries about athletes manage to capture honestly: the space between what the athlete dreamed of and what life delivered. For Rodgers, that space exists. A Super Bowl where there could have been 2 or 3. Conference championship eliminations that, added together, tell a story of near misses that no MVP number can completely erase. The injury that robbed him of his first season in New York, just when it seemed like the final act was being written. But there is something else that exists in this space, and it is equally honest. Proof that Chico's journey to Lambeau Field, from junior college to the inevitable Hall of Fame, was not accidental. It was not the product of favorable circumstances or a system that pushed him in the right direction. It was the product of a boy who was ignored by the system, and who, instead of adapting to the system, made the system adapt to him. Aaron Rodgers isn't just in the conversation about the greatest. He is one of the greatest. And the difference between these two formulations is precisely the distance between what the sport promised a teenager from Chico that no university wanted, and what that teenager went to achieve with his own hands, on his own terms, against all the expectations that the world had placed on him since that 2005 draft, where 23 teams decided to look in the other direction. The silence of that day was never forgotten. He carried it with him to every game, to every touchdown, to every MVP, to every night at Lambeau Field when the turf was frozen and the air was biting and the whole world was watching. And he said, not with words, but with every decision he made inside a pocket, that he had understood something about perseverance that goes far beyond sports. This is Aaron Rodgers' legacy. Not just what he did, but what he did from where he started.